The mind of our culture. One of the things that helps this disease of moral hysteria to progress is detachment from identification of ourselves as our experience. Hard physical work for the sake of survival used to keep more people in touch with the world of being. As life becomes less toil and more thinking and problem solving, there is less opportunity to have one's attention called forth from the mind by more immediate demands of survival on a day-to-day basis. The gap created by lack of grounding in our experience leaves us dependent on ideas, principles, rules, values, and imagination as our primary modes of orientation. These ideas and values are tightly held in the same way an adolescent grasps onto roles when he joins a gang or becomes a Christian or a Hare Krishna or falls in love and gets married in high school. Without roles and rules, we fear we will lose control of ourselves. We will go crazy. We will lose our minds. The more intensely these rules and roles are defended, the further removed from grounding and experience the individual becomes. After enough practice at role-playing and idealism, our whole way of orienting ourselves in the world depends on principles of orientation rather than on the ability to respond as needed based on what we perceive. This moralism, this web of entrapment of human aliveness, is a crippling disease. We all have it. It is terminal. It cannot be cured. It is a hell of a lot worse than herpes. It is as deadly as AIDS. It is in our schools. It is in our minds. It is in the bloodstream of our culture. It is in this book. Sometimes I receive letters from people who have heard that I am an expert on stress management. They ask me to suggest what they can do about stress and various psychosomatic disorders. They want recommendations about how to behave and what to do. I know when I write back that whatever I tell them probably won't work. Whatever advice I give them will be used as another principle to beat themselves over the head with, which is what caused the problem in the first place. Moralists who read about ways to beat stress only make these ways into new rules with which to oppress themselves. People who try to take a shit at 7 a.m. precisely every day, whether they need to or not, are different from people who take a shit when they feel like they need to.
J. Edgar Hoover died of apoplexy. Maybe he popped a blood vessel in righteous indignation. I like to imagine he was reading a book on stress management at the time.
Field independence versus field dependence. A number of experiments in the past 30 or 40 years have been designed to study what psychologists call field dependence and field independence. Imagine this scene. A person is seated in a darkened room. 10 feet in front of this person, the subject, stands another person holding a luminescent square frame surrounding a luminescent straight rod. The room is darkened. All the subject can see is the frame and the rod. Both the frame and the rod are mounted on an axle, so they may each be rotated in both directions. The person holding the frame and rod rotates both the frame and the rod at random for a while. The frame is stopped then, and the rod continues moving for a little while. The person holding the rod and frame then says to the subject, "Tell me when the rod is straight up and down, the same as the walls outside." Some people will make the rod straight up and down by using the square as a frame of reference. These people are called field dependent because they depend on the context or field provided by the frame to judge when the rod is perpendicular. Other people line the rod straight up and down with regard to their own bodies. These people are called field independent because they operate independent of the square as a frame of reference. Another variation of this experiment has the subject strapped into a tilting chair inside a room that tilts. Motors tilt both the room and the chair, and they stop at some point at random. The subject in the chair is instructed to give verbal instructions to the operator of the motor that moves the chair to make himself line up straight. Field-dependent subjects will tolerate up to a 33-degree angle of tilt and will say they are aligned with the walls outside as long as they are tilted in the same direction as the room. Like those who depend on the frame to judge the angle of the rod, these field-dependent people depend on the tilt of the room to adjust the tilt of the chair in which they sit, even though their own bodies are telling them that they are not sitting upright. There is further research that demonstrates that field dependence is correlated with social dependence. Field-dependent, socially dependent people take their cues from external frames of reference. Field independence is correlated with social independence and with creativity. Artists tend to be field independent. Those who learn to depend on rules rather than the seats of their pants, like lawyers, tend to be field dependent. Catholic parochial school is an excellent method for the accomplishment of field dependence. Parochial school students, like law students, make better sheep than people. Catholic education and law schools provide me with a lot of miserable people as psychotherapy clients. I should be grateful. These people are looking for rescue from their education. The problem is they all want me to tell them what to do so they can try hard to do it, be better than anyone else at it, and get good grades so God will love them. Depending on an external frame of reference for social orientation leads you to try to manipulate other people to get what you want rather than getting it on your own. What the well-trained, field-dependent client usually does is try to con the therapist into telling him to do what he already wants to do, but is afraid of failing and getting blamed for. So if he fails, he can blame the authority who told him to do it. Fritz Perls said in 1946, "Principles are substitutes for an independent outlook. The owner would be lost in the ocean of events if he were not able to orient himself by these fixed bearings. Usually he is even proud of them, and does not regard them as weaknesses, but as a source of strength. He hangs on to them because of the insufficiency of his own independent judgment." We are all afraid to give up our moralism. We're afraid that if we do, we'll get out of control. We might do something bad or bizarre or crazy. We might go out of our minds. Erik Erikson, in the biography Young Man Luther, speculates that someday maybe there will exist a well-informed, well-considered, and yet fervent public conviction that the most deadly of all possible sins is the mutilation of a child's spirit, for such mutilation undercuts the life principle of trust, without which every human act, may it feel ever so good and seem ever so right, is prone to perversion by destructive forms of conscientiousness. When we take innocent and open children and train them to be moralists, we train them at the same time to be liars. Moralism is lying. Moralism and lying go hand in hand. Being good and looking good, conscientiously valued, lead directly to lying. If you can fool the nuns into believing you're a good kid like they want you to be, you can secretly do what you want. Moral instruction, stringently imposed, tears children loose from their grounding in experience, from their trust of the world based on just being here, and makes them into conscientious, suffering torturers of the next generation. In Erikson's words, the child forced out of fear to pretend that he is better when seen than when unseen, is left to anticipate the day when he will have the brute power to make others more moral than he ever intends to be himself. The death grip with which one holds on to principles is a source of unhappiness and anger. We can make a moral resolve that people should let up on themselves and other people, but that is just more impotent moralism. If moralism is as common and influential in our society as I have described, how might one use the disease? That is, instead of attempting to cure it, how could we manage it and deal creatively with its use? Managing the disease of moralism is done by telling the truth, like children do, before they lose their innocence. I have this disease. I want to use it rather than be used by it. How can I not just manage my critical, self-judgmental, mean to those closest to me self, but use it to be happy, productive, and alive? My clients and friends and I have been having success in managing moralism by telling the truth. The scary thing is that no one else can predict what will happen to you if you attempt to let up on your moralism. Only you can discover that by abandoning the protection of your moralism in some way. Taking that risk is moving toward independence. Self-reliance is field independence. Moral hysteria is field dependence. In the work I do, the most interesting questions are, can someone who has learned to be field dependent and socially dependent learn independence? Can moralism be transformed
from a life-threatening disease to a managed one? The answer to both questions is yes, if the person is willing to tell the truth.
Chapter 2. The First Truth. The world is my womb, and my mother's womb was my first world. R.D. Laing. We gradually begin to think of ourselves in the course of growing up as personalities made up of all the lessons we've learned. Our hard-earned lessons count heavily in our consideration of who we are. We complicate our lives by holding on to these hard-earned lessons long after they've outlived their usefulness. Take, for example, the child who learns to persistently beg his mother in a whiny voice, first for cookies and later for the keys to the car. Since it worked with Mom, and since Dad left most of that up to Mom, he keeps using what works. At age 40, he may still be treating his third wife the same way without having gotten these same results for years. The mind doesn't like to change itself in the face of new information. Lessons learned and held on to in this fashion make up the personality to which we are shackled. This makes life harder than it has to be. The way out of this suffering is to expand who we consider ourselves to be. We must return to being more than the personalities we have shrunk to during the course of growing up. By the time we're old enough to ride a bike, we are personalities. In the course of learning to be personalities, we forget something we knew before we had any vested interest in behaving
consistently. That is, the common sense of unity in the womb before we knew we existed.
These are my basic premises about how we all began. The earth happened by chance, and chemistry brought us to be. After a long period of evolution, you and I showed up. After about the first 4 or 5 months in the womb, we had our first experience of being, a dawning of consciousness. The first experience we all had was when life came on. Dawn seems to be the best metaphor for this. Dawn happens in a slow and almost indistinguishable way, a long time before sunrise. The light of life came on for us in the same way, a long time before birth. The Hindus call consciousness the light that enlightens the light. or the light that allows us to see light. In the womb is where this light, our consciousness, first occurred. For the first time we experienced experience itself. It happened like dawn, where the gradual accumulation of light makes it impossible to say when day has happened, but suddenly it is there. That is, we were our experience. The fetus matured until the wiring was complete, and suddenly experiencing was. What we were in the womb was a unity of experiencing. The unity of experience went on for an eternity. In our time, the time we know about now, it was 4 or 5 months. Then it was an eternity. Then it was eternity. We never forget that time, but we have no way of remembering it in a way that we can describe. It is indefinable, unrememberable in any graspable way. All religions, gods, metaphysics, theologies, philosophies, and teachings of masters of all faiths are attempts to remember these eternal months past, this lost sense of unity. Since the beginning of human history, priests have been trying to put this sense of unity into words, trying to communicate about the ineffable. They knew something was there, but didn't know how to talk about it, yet couldn't resist trying. And the more they talked, the more confusion arose between the attempt to define unity and the actual experience of unity. As a result of our inability to put it into words, this experience of oneness, a commonplace experience, has now become highly overrated. Enlightenment is knowing unity. It's not being able to talk about it. The philosophy of enlightenment is talking about or trying to describe the experience of unity. Unity is the nature of things. It doesn't take any work. It is the given. We are each creators of the universe out of our own being. What is given us to experience is a unity, within which we make distinctions. The sound we hear when our ears are stopped up is the electrical generator of unity. When our eyes are closed, the darkness we see is the generator of unity. When our eyes are open, whatever we see is who we actually are. As Krishnamurti says, you are the world. From the moment life starts, the being we are constantly creates the world with its senses. The world grows and the mind grows out of this unity. The world is created for us out of our fundamental equipment, our being. We are constantly creating the world by merely perceiving. When we hear, we are creating sound. When we see, we are creating that which is seen in our visual cortex. When we integrate sight, sound, smell, touch, balance, movement, etc., our involuntary nervous system creates the world. When we die, for all practical purposes, the world comes to an end. We are, nevertheless, each creators of the world. But since we do it effortlessly, and everyone does it, it doesn't count for much in our considerations of who we are. Usually we consider creating meaning to be more important than creating the world. We take for granted our function as creators of the world and focus much more attention on creating meaning. We are preoccupied with the power of interpretation. We are much more interested in our uniqueness, derived from what we have worked to learn, than in the source of our power as creators. It is our fate as human beings to grasp after the ineffable, trying to regain a lost sense of unity. Even so, when we do get in touch with unity, the vastness of our being for a few seconds, we usually run away. We feel as if we are about to lose something. We are. We are about to lose the protection and safety of the limited definition of self we have come to think we are. We are afraid of losing who we think we are, which is special, and we are afraid of becoming who we actually are, which is not special. When we become aware of ourselves as indefinable, uncategorizable, simple creators of the world, we lose all certainty, being present to the immediate moment-to-moment passing of the world, the fragility of our own being, and the relative unimportance of the personality we think we are, is a terrifying experience. Being fully aware of our ever-present, ever-changing existence throws us into the same ineffable state as when the light came on when we were unseeing in the womb. Simultaneous awareness of the life of being and the lesser importance of the personality to which we have become attached is a second enlightenment that comes to all humans who grow up beyond the stage of adolescence. But it feels like dying. To avoid the trauma of it, the great majority of us remain adolescents until the end of our years. This is not a minor philosophical point. This is the heart of the matter. Most of us would rather kill ourselves than be, particularly if who we think we are keeps dying, and many of us do. The birth of being. Go back for a moment in your imagination and memory to the beginning. There are sounds like intestines rumbling, sensations are stirring, and there is a vague sense of movement in other sounds like dolphins calling to each other under the sea. In this beginning there is no seeing, thus no dark. To the unborn there is no knowledge of darkness because there is no light and no mind to contrast dark and light. Experiences in this unseeing world begin to form the mind. Here in the background, which is all that we are, which lasts however long we do, we are our beginning. You can go back there any time you like. I often do when I meditate. Here in a background, which is all that we are, which lasts however long we do, we are our beginning. Much later, a true eternity later, the experience of birth, light, air, breathing, and pain flood the being. The mind is born out of this ocean of experience, before and after birth. Even after 7 months in the womb, the unborn baby is capable of learning to respond in a predictable fashion to outside stimuli, such as sound. Laboratory experiments have found that a 7-month-old fetus will react to an electrical shock to the mother's womb with a full contraction. When this shock is applied along with a loud sound, the fetus is conditioned after only a few trials to go into a full contraction at the loud sound without any electrical shock. An association between the sound and shock is made. Therefore, learning has occurred. So now we know, thanks to evil scientists who have tortured fetuses in this manner, that the mind begins to form from associations between ebbs and flows in the ocean of experience prior to birth. This grouping of replicated experiences begins to form the mind. Sometimes shortly after birth, we demarcate a little area, a smaller sea, from our ocean of experience. Our mother's breast, our mother, our hand, our body, our clothes, our bed, our room get distinguished for us. We become a sea of suggestions. We grow up all the rest of the way surrounded and protected by this expanding sea of suggestions, and it becomes who we think we are. Thousands of refinements later, a group of suggestions becomes who we think we are. Who we actually are, of course, remains always more than the mental images we form while growing up. For we are the experiencer of what is momentarily present. First of all, we are that. Second, we are the multisensory recorder of experience. Last, and less importantly, we are the rememberer. Later, we are most focused on remembering our own reputations. But who we always really are from the beginning is a context, a parenthesis, a being, who creates the world for itself by sensing. We are the being who is the source of being and remembering. Recontacting that basic beginning electrical sensate self rescues us from the mind, the murderer, and potential ally within.